Now we're going to talk about Islam and the Crusades. At the time, the Crusades were seen as a great victory by most people in Europe. When the Crusades happened, it was a great military victory. However, as history has played out, in time they have come to be seen as one of the greatest tragedies of medieval Christianity. We have gone in this course from a time when the church fathers debated theology, and we've looked at a large portion of that in order to gain and come to a deeper, more true understanding of the Godhead, to now here in 1095 sending Christians as soldiers against the infidel. How does something like this happen? What was going on? And were the Crusades really a terrible and bad thing? Those are some of the questions that people ask today when we look at what happened in Christianity back in the medieval period, the high medieval period. So you can't understand the Crusades without understanding Islam. So what is the background of Islam? Well, Muhammad was born in 570 or around 570 and died in 632. And he was, in his life, was centered around the town of Mecca. Mecca was a center of trade and was a center of religious activity for the Arab world. Muhammad was a camel driver, and at 25 years of age, he married a 40-year-old wealthy woman. And he ran the family fruit business until he was about 40 years of age. And it was then that he began to receive visions or revelations in a cave 3 miles north of Mecca. And so he was sort of always a sort of mystic, and he was involved in the religion of his tribe, and so he was also paying attention to what the Jews and some of the heretical Christians, like the Nestorians, were doing. And so he became sort of like a little bit of a mystic, and albeit like a sort of pagan mystic. And he had appreciation for the Bible, the what we would call the Bible. He had some appreciation for Judaism and some of the things that they had, Christianity, and all of that. And then all of a sudden, he in going into the cave and meditating and all of that, he began to receive visions and revelations in a cave 3 miles to the north of Mecca. And he claimed that the angel Gabriel visited him. And when the angel would visit him, he would go into epileptic fits of shaking and perspiring and foaming at the mouth. Now, you might want to look up Luke 9:39-42 and see a similar thing where a man has a son who's possessed by a demon. Revelations from angels of light that said that he was the angel Gabriel. Now, whenever someone says they received revelations from an angel of light, why should that make you nervous? Why should that make you nervous? Right? 2 Corinthians 11:14 says that even the devil can masquerade as an angel of light. And that's exactly what happened with Muhammad. And interestingly, and it's outside of this particular course, but interestingly, there was another man named Joseph Smith who is the founder of the Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in the early 19th century, who also said that he received visions from an angel of light who was actually Gabriel. And Mormonism and Islam, if you do a comparative study of them, are actually similar in many ways. And I think the devil was masquerading as an angel of light, or one of his demons was, with both of these men. Now, the main message that was given to Muhammad was that there is no God but Allah. Man is Allah's slave, and the day of judgment is coming to weigh good and bad deeds. Now, who was Allah? Allah actually happened to be his tribal deity, and his tribal deity happened to be the moon, and the moon god Sin, and so the moon god also had sent and come to earth in this black rock that the Muslims still claim to worship in the Kaaba in Mecca. So it's really Muhammad's tribal deity that he puts up and says that this is Allah, this is the God that we must worship. Now, after his visions, he fled to the town of Medina in 622, and this is year 1 in the Muslim calendar. And he tried to get the Christians and Jews to follow him, but was rejected. And then, because he was rejected, he received further revelations to loot and plunder traveling caravans, and that happened to belong to Christians and Jews and people that didn't worship his tribal deity Allah, and whom he called pagans. And then he tried to kill and drive out the Jews as well. In 629, he returned to Mecca with 10,000 men and forced all of them to embrace Islam. And by his death in 632, all of Arabia had become Muslim, or had come under the Islamic fold. Within 21 years of Muhammad's death, his movement covered as much territory as the Roman Empire had once ruled. That's amazing. It was a religion of the sword. Within 100 years after Muhammad's death, Islam had spread across North Africa and Turkey and all the way up into Europe. During the 8th century, Islam advanced into Western Europe before being gradually driven back. Muslim forces crossed into the Iberian Peninsula, which is where Spain is, in 711. They established Islamic rule in modern Spain and Portugal, and they began campaigns to expand into France. The Muslim invasion of France in northern Europe ended only because in 732 there was a great Frankish victory by the barbarian tribe of the Franks at the Battle of Tours with Charles Martel. Charles Martel, known as Charles the Hammer, defeated them, and Charles Martel was the grandfather of Charlemagne, or Charles the Great king of the Franks, the great king of France, the founder of the Carolingian Empire. Over the next several centuries, Christian forces in Spain gradually advanced until they succeeded in recapturing the last Muslim outpost in 1492. So it took centuries for this to happen, for the Christian forces in Spain to gradually overthrow the Muslims and get them out of Spain, which happened in 1492. During the 9th century, Islam spread into Persia and Pakistan and India. Europe lived in fear of Islam during this time, entering from the east until the late 17th century. And after centuries of conflict with the Turks, the Christian Byzantine Empire was finally defeated at the capture of Constantinople in 1453. And so Turkey has remained a part of the Islamic Empire, if you will, ever since then. Turkish forces advanced into southeastern Europe at times and attempted to invade Central Europe. After the defeat of the Turks near Vienna in 1683, Muslim influence in Eastern Europe began to recede. So this was seen, rightly so, as a false religion by the Christians. The Christians saw the Muslims as the infidel, which is interesting because that's what the Muslims claim for the Christians, that they are infidels. It was the Muslims were knocking on the door of the Eastern Empire all the time, and as well as southern Spain, and they had fully taken North Africa. They were threatening to overwhelm all of Europe, and this caused great fear and anxiety for Christians. And it was only because of men like Charles Martel that it was stopped. So great fear and anxiety for the Christians reigned during this time. Well, what are the teachings of Islam? Islam's central confession is there is but one God, and Muhammad is his prophet. In Muslim thought, the belief that they believe in Jesus, and they will tell you that they believe in Jesus, but Jesus is to them only a prophet. When we talk about Jesus as being divine, as being God, and being fully God and fully man, to them that is sounding like polytheism, which we know it is not. According to Islam, Jesus was a prophet of God who then was later superseded by the greatest and final prophet, and that was Muhammad. The Allah of Islam is primarily conceived in terms of power, transcendence, greatness, rather than in terms of goodness and love and encouragement or support. Now, the essence of Islam is service and submission to this high and exalted deity named Allah. The holy book of Islam is the Quran. The Quran is believed to contain the revelation that Muhammad received, recorded in 114 chapters, or as they call them, surahs. The Quran is basically poetic in character and is written as a collection of instructions or precepts rather than a narrative or a treatise with a clear logical development. Islam means submission, and its main moral requirements are to abide by its 5 pillars. And so there can be some variation within Islam, and there is variation within Islam, but every Muslim, every true good Muslim, will live by the 5 pillars. And the first is the confession that Allah is the only God and that Muhammad is his prophet. 2, that you pray 5 times each day facing Mecca. 3, that you give alms to the poor. 4, that you would fast during the month of Ramadan from sun down to sun up, during the day from sunrise to sundown. And after that, then, after the sun goes down, then you can have whatever party you want. And 5th, if possible, you should make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your lifetime. Islam, we need to understand, is both a religion and a culture. And they seek to spread not only the religion, but also the culture of Islam worldwide. Many Muslims are resistant to cultural changes because such changes could be seen as challenges to Islam's religious claims. And wherever Islam spreads, it brings its set of laws and cultural values, which they call Sharia law. And so that is what is instituted wherever they go and whatever they conquer. Now, that's the background of Islam. What are the reasons for the Crusades? Why a crusade against the Muslims? So the first and foremost reason why the West came against the Muslims was to defeat the Muslims and defend their brothers in the Byzantine Empire, to give aid to the Byzantines. The thought by some was that this would reunite the East and the West. And so you remember we've talked a little bit about some of the divisions that had occurred down through the ages. And so perhaps if we go and help our brothers in the East, this will reunite us as one Christian church. It was also a goal for reconquering the Holy Land, and in so doing, it was thought that they would win heaven. And all of these were sort of initially achieved, but not permanently achieved. Now, the First Crusade was probably the most successful, and that was from 1095 to 1099. For many centuries, Christians had held the Holy Land, the land of Israel, in high esteem. And so there were many pilgrimages that were made to holy places there. Now, these, as the Muslims took over, were held in captivity by the Muslims and by the Turks. And they were also threatening the eastern borders of Byzantium. And so Pope Urban, and they had cut off many of the abilities of the pilgrims to go to Israel and make these pilgrimages. And so Pope Urban II at Clermont in North France rallied the people to take on this burden of going against the Turks to free the East from oppression. I mean, the Turks were even controlling the town, the city of Nicaea. And so free the East from oppression, and free Nicaea, and free the Holy Land from the Muslims. And he said this, I say to these who are present, I command that it be said to those who are absent, Christ commands it. All who go thither and lose their lives, be it on the road or on the sea, or in the fight against the pagans, will be granted immediate forgiveness for their sins. This I grant to all who will march, by virtue of the great gift which Christ has given to me. Well, that was Pope Urban II. Now, times were difficult in Europe at the time, and there were crop failures. Knights were constantly fighting each other, Christian against Christian. There were disease. There was some disease and some plagues, and this opportunity was well received to be able to free Christians up to be able to go against the infidel. And so it was received with enthusiasm. And when Pope Urban II said these things, the cry went up, Deus vult, God wills it. Well, soon visions begin to be seen by people. They see visions of comets and angels and deceased saints and Jesus and Mary and the holy city. And so it was this whole apocalyptic visions that appear. Peter the Hermit can't wait, and so he organizes a mob of these we call them riffraff in America, maybe deletes you might call them in India, to go to Jerusalem, to set out pillaging the land of crops and goods, and they practiced fighting the infidel by killing the Jews, and many died along the way. The formal crusade was actually led by Adhemar, a bishop of Pi, and he had 40,000 people with him, 90% of whom were foot soldiers and non-combatants, and they left to walk 2,000 miles to the Holy Land. Military leaders were Godfrey of Bouillon from France, Raymond of St. Gilles, Tancred, Robert, Duke of Normandy, Robert, Count of Flanders, and they all converged on Constantinople, welcomed by Emperor Alexius there. And they began to conquer cities nearby. Nicaea, which was the capital of the Turks. Most then eventually moved towards the east and laid siege to Antioch, and were able to overtake Antioch eventually. It was while there in Antioch that the Crusaders began to run out of food and other provisions, and many started to desert. And finally, an Armenian Christian opened the gate for the Crusaders there as they laid siege to Antioch, and they stormed in and they were able to take Antioch. 4 days later, a large Turkish army arrived as reinforcements and laid siege to the Crusaders within, and the Crusaders were discouraged by these turn of events. But suddenly someone had a vision, and they were really good at having visions, and they were led to by this person to a place where a piece of metal could be construed to have been this spear, showing a sign of victory, and this was seen as a sign from God, and so they launched an attack and defeated the Turks. Well, it was while here that Bishop Ademar died of fever during the siege, and Geoffrey of Bouillon became the leader. And so they headed to the holy city of Jerusalem on June 7th, 1099, where they laid siege to the city. The summer months and conditions of the summer there were horrible, with 100-degree temperatures. And remember, these guys are wearing armor over their bodies, metal armor over their bodies, chainmail. They had lack of food. They had a lack of water. The only water that they could get was 5 miles from the city, and so many of the soldiers were parched and thirsty all the time. And so then they received a vision from Peter Desiderius to repent and walk barefoot around the city. And at the same time, being soldiers, they built wooden towers and scaling ladders and catapults that could toss a 300-pound rock 150 yards. And finally, on hearing that a large Turkish army was coming, they prayed and they begged God for support, and they attacked the city. And while resistance was strong, eventually a single knight scaled the wall and held his position, and others were able to get in, and soon they had taken the city. And the Muslim defenders fled the city on July 15th, 1099. And it was really a bloodbath. It was a shameful event in many ways, as many of the civilians, non-combatants, were killed. Women were actually raped. Infants were dashed. Some of the Jews were set on fire, who supposedly helped the infidel. It was said that the horses of the knights waded in blood up to their bellies. The knights then divided up the Holy Lands like manors of Europe and held this area for about 100 years. Well, that was the first crusade. And while it was successful and they were able to hold most of this land for 100 years, other crusades, the Muslims would come in and begin to attack, and then once again they would have to send reinforcements from Europe. So there ended up being approximately 7 or 8 crusades that were stretched all the way to the mid-1200s. And just wave after wave of soldiers went forth from Europe, going to fight the Muslim infidel. Well, there was also a continuing crusade, and that was in Spain. And the Spanish... So, before I get to Spain, let me step back just a moment and say that all of these crusades, eventually people grew tired of them. They grew tired of sending forth the knights and the soldiers, and eventually they basically lost the Holy Lands. Though it was, for the most part, parts of the Holy Lands, parts of Israel were held for approximately 150 to 200 years. Eventually, people grew tired of the Crusades, and the Holy Lands fell in about 1272 to the Muslims, and the Muslims controlled it after that. So the continuing crusade was really the Spanish against, called the Spanish Reconquista, and against the Muslims in Spain. So Spain had been really destroyed by the Muslims in the 8th century. Christians only remained in the very north and in the east, and from this, from these Christians would come resistance known as the Reconquest or the Reconquista. And they discovered the tomb of Santiago, St. James in the north. James, the Apostle James, who is said to have been one of the apostles who went to Spain. So this became a center for pilgrimages to Santiago. And Western Europe sympathized with the plight of the Spanish against the Moors. The Muslims in Spain were called the Moors. In 1002, the great Caliph of Cordova died, and kingdom was divided, and Spaniards took advantage of this, and by 1085 had taken the city of Toledo. Fighting waged continuously until 1212, when Christian kings united to defeat the Moors, but they could not take Granada in the south, which remained in the Moorish hands and Muslim control until Ferdinand and Isabella finally took it in 1492. Spain and Sicily were the only areas where military campaigns were actually permanently successful against the Muslims. So, what are the results of the Crusades? What we have with the Crusades is increased mistrust between the Muslims and Christians, and continued mistrust and division between the East and the West, because there were several Crusades where the Western Knights came in, and it was easier to invade and conquer places like Constantinople than it was to go all the way to the Holy Lands. And so they inflicted war upon their Eastern brethren. Shameful behavior by fellow Christians. Another result was that it increased the power of the papacy. It was the popes that were really calling for the Crusades against the Muslim infidels. And this also resulted in the entrenched idea that it was all right to wage war against your enemy, true, real war, battle war against your enemies. And this impacted Europe, and Europe would be impacted by many wars, even up until very modern times, waging war against your enemy. This impacted Christian piety as well, by drawing people to the historical narratives of Christ in the Holy Lands. And so when they heard about the areas of the Holy Lands where Christ walked, and then and they knew the scriptures, and they'd heard the stories of the scriptures, people wanted to go there and see these things. And so Christian piety as well increased as people heard about the lands that were still there, that they could see where Jesus walked. And so people wanted to be more holy. But part of that became one of the results was the entrenchment of the veneration of relics. And so by relics, they started collecting these things, these relics from the age of the apostles. And so some said that they brought back this piece of wood and said, this is a piece of the true cross. And some brought back bones of the patriarchs, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Some brought back teeth of biblical figures, and so they would bring these back to their towns and villages in Western Europe, and they would set up a shrine where people could pay money to come to these places for maybe healing powers or something like that. It became very superstitious. It's kind of funny, but there's a story that there was enough pieces of the cross to build the ark, and so meaning that everybody came home with a piece of the true cross. It also increased the awareness of the need to combat heresy, and one of the heretical groups that they actually came against in Europe was the Albigensians. It renewed interest in theology, and because the Christians came back with the teachings of Muslim and Jewish philosophers who were Aristotelian. They had become followers of Aristotle and Greek philosophy, and so this helped bring Aristotle back to Europe, and that resulted in men like Thomas Aquinas picking up on Aristotle and using some of his philosophy for his theology. It also influenced the building of cities and the development of trade, because money is being coined again as these merchants who have gone to the east now begin to trade and bring in wealth and all of those things. Well, those are some of the effects of the Crusades. What's the aftermath of the Crusades? The Crusades stand out as a just this interesting and tragic development in the history of Western Christendom. There were good things in that. The fact that they felt like the Western Christians felt like they needed to protect their wives and families from the infidel. And there's good things about that. They thought that they were going to be invaded, and so they wanted to stop that from happening. So those are good things. They wanted to protect Christendom from the advancement of a false religion. But in the end, there wasn't a whole lot that really happened that was of permanent, lasting, good consequence. And so there's sort of a stain upon Christianity in the eyes of many, especially Muslims, over this. But at the same time, we got to understand that the Muslims likewise were attacking Christians. And so it was a time of warfare. It was a time of just a tough time, and just not very helpful, really. So the Crusades both illustrate and contribute to problems and challenges that are with us even down yet to today, including some of the division in Christianity between the East and the West. So what can we say about the Crusades? They're a result of the continuing degradation of Christianity, sort of as Christianity becomes more and more big and corrupt. This was one of the results, where there wasn't a lot of Christian stuff going on. There were Christian soldiers. There were true Christian soldiers, like King Louis IX. But overall, by and large, it was more of a tragedy. So it demonstrated the intense integration of church and state as well, where the church called for this, and then the state went and enacted that. So, and the impact that we still feel today between interactions, relations between Muslims and Christians in the West, those are as well some of the lasting impacts that we feel even yet in our day. And so those things are part and parcel of what the Crusades brought, and so big part of what happened in for a couple hundred years in Christian history. So have a good night.